5 minutes to...
Mr. Chairman, could I make a comment, please, on Mr.
Actually,
chart?
let me just yield to the gentlewoman from Washington, D.C.
I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank you for this hearing. Because causality is always a difficult issue under the best of circumstances, I take it the panel would agree that with the growth in people of color in our country, that radio should see a growth overall in listeners from people of color. Could we agree on that?
Yes, I would, Congresswoman.
Mr. Straczynski, I have to tell you I am no Luddite, and I understand what you are trying to do. Indeed, I was impressed with the series of graphs involving one man. I should have thought that anybody, by the way, getting back a diary that said they did anything 8 hours a day would have understood that that meant that they weren't doing that continually. So I was, I'm impressed by the difference and what you capture. I'd be much more impressed with seeing that captured with a sample rather than one man. I can pick out one man any day of the week and prove anything you would like. I understand what you are getting at, but until you show me a sample that shows that kind of pattern, I'm not sure I am convinced. Look, what's at issue here may be the life and death of one of the most viable industries for people of color. So obviously there's going to be some concern in the Congress about that, and particularly about these fluctuations. I am super sensitive to what's happening to every business of every kind in the United States today. The only entity able to write a check today is the United States government, and that's because we don't have to have the money in the bank. So I understand that every industry is affected, and yet it would seem to me that there's an obligation on the part of the Congress to try to ask the question that I ask of you, Mr. Straczynski. How can we, can you say with any certainty that PPM is not a significant ingredient in what is happening to stations, minority-owned stations, and that the rest of it must be something else, like the recession? Can you say that with any certainty?
Congresswoman, we do not believe that PPM is the root cause of problems.
On what is that belief grounded? On what is it based?
The radio industry is suffering right now, as you noted, Congresswoman, with the general economy. There has been a decline in revenue for all broadcasters. Are you
seeing these declines equally among stations that service majority populations and minority populations? No difference whatsoever.
There have been, in terms of revenue declines, there have been the same revenue declines percentage-wise for the general market as has been the case for Hispanic and urban broadcasters.
Whatever you are basing that on, you say the general market, that would include minority stations. I'm asking stations that I can name some in the District of Columbia, for it, that target certain areas which we know to be largely white, as opposed to stations which target areas where the population is minority. Have you that kind of research on which you would base what you have just said to this committee?
We do, Congresswoman. When I was referring to the general market, I was referring to, that's a term in the radio industry, general meaning not stations that are targeted at an urban or Hispanic broadcaster. And I believe Mr. Liggins of Radio 1 is going to speak in the next segment of the panel, and he can share with you the specific details.
All right, I've read Mr. Liggins' testimony. I know him. I respect him. Indeed, Radio 1 is located in my district, and therefore I was very, very interested in his testimony. Of course, Mr. Liggins sits at the helm of an empire, not simply a station, and I admire what he and Kathy Hughes have done, love them dearly. Are you, in fact, telling this committee that all the other minority stations have to do is to do what Radio 1 did? Alter their programming, and they will increase their PPM ratings. Is that your advice to stations not a part of an empire, which may have been able more easily to make this change? Just do what Radio 1 did, and you fellas are going to be all right.
Well, Congresswoman, we're not in the business of advising radio broadcasters what to do. And, of course, the programming decisions are the decisions made by the individual broadcaster. I cited in my oral testimony that Stevie Wonder station, KJLH in the Los Angeles area, looked at in this particular case, the programming director of that station looked at the PPM data, which is very granular data, and made a decision to switch over to the Steve Harvey
What would keep a station from simply incorporating what you say these successful stations have done? What would make a station not want to do that?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the first part.
What would keep a minority-owned station from doing what Radio 1 and the station you have just cited did? What keeps them from doing it, in your view?
There would be no obstacle in having them make that change.
Well, do you have an answer to that, Ms.?
I would love to answer that. I think what keeps us from doing that is if we thought that these were reliable and accurate estimates, then we would do what we do with other audience estimates and use it to make programming decisions. But given the inaccuracy of the sample and the fact that the people providing that information are not representative of Hispanics or of African Americans, we cannot make programming decisions. When I started out in this business and I tried to explain to someone at an English language broadcast network that the differences he was seeing was because the universe was changing, he said to me, I don't care if it's right or wrong, I just want to program to the sample. We don't believe that at Univision. We believe that we have an obligation to the 15 million Hispanic radio listeners to provide them with entertainment and with information they need. And we are not going to change our programming until we have samples that are representative of those listeners, and then we can use that information to improve. We're not going to do it based on bad information.
Mr. Honig, you had a response.
I wanted to cut right to this question of causation. Mr. Skarzinski correctly recognizes that this is not the only problem, the only burden facing minority radio. Those stations also are burdened by lack of access to capital, by weaker signals historically, by outdated engineering rules, by EEO non-enforcement, and by advertisers that won't consider advertising on them simply because of the race of members of the audience. Those problems have existed for years, and notwithstanding them, as horrible as they are, stations continue to perform well in those formats until they get disrupted by PPM. You see the numbers collapse in the markets where currency has been granted, and only in those markets over the last 2 years have the numbers collapsed. That's about as clear a case of causation as you can see. It certainly is no justification for this kind of practice that there are other deficiencies. It was no justification for school segregation that there was housing segregation, for example. Nor is it an answer to say that there are some broadcasters that have managed to overcome or adjust. No one should have to adjust the heart of their business because of a flawed technology.
Gentlewoman's time has expired.